Welcome to the Not Sorry Art podcast. I'm Sari, the artist and creator behind Not Sorry Art. I'm so excited to talk art and creativity with you, so grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's dive in. Are you looking to gain confidence in your painting practice and improve your sense of color, composition, drawing? At Not Sorry Art School, I teach representational painting techniques that'll help you feel more in control of your art and elevate your abilities. With 16 courses from color theories to master studies, painting water, portrait painting, and our latest edition, painting fabric, you'll have everything you need to master representational painting. With access to current and future courses, a supportive community, and personalized feedback, you'll be well on your way to achieving your artistic goals. Lifetime students get full access to all of this, but if you're not ready to commit yet, try our free 7-day boot camp. This is a great way to experience a bite-sized version of what our full course has to offer. To become a lifetime student or check out the 7-day boot camp, make sure to click the link in the show notes. I also wanted to say that today's episode is sponsored by my book. I have a book coming out. I'm so proud of this, guys. The links are already up. I'll have them in the show notes. But the book is called Modern Still Life, From Fruit Bowls to Disco Balls. It is my take on a step-by-step painting book. I am really excited about it. Not only does it have like motivational tips and tricks to keep you going in your practice, but it also has clear and beautiful and full color breakdowns of the step-by-step process in my paintings. So I could not be more excited about it. If you wanted to check it out, order it. It would help me more than you even know. Welcome back to the Not Sorry Art podcast. I'm Sari. Thanks for being here. Today's episode is the final installment of this year's Summer Book Club series with Megan E. Collins, where we discuss Bianca Bosker's 2024 book, Get the Picture. This book is a joyous journey into the art world via Bosker, a journalist who takes on multiple art-adjacent roles, such as gallery assistant, museum security guard, studio assistant, and more, as she immerses herself into the mysterious and insular worlds of creating, selling, collecting, and viewing art. Megan and I thoroughly cherish this read, and I hope you enjoy our conversation about the book. Also, be sure to follow Megan at Virgo Like Beyonce on TikTok and The Manicured Shelf on Instagram for more on her work as a pop culture anthropologist and podcast host of her own show, Megan's Podcast. If you want to see all those links, I put them down below in the show note. Enjoy this week's episode. Hello, Megan. I'm so excited to chat with you today. Megan, of course, is my co-collaborator on the last episode of the Summer Book Club series. I can't believe it is coming to an end again. It always comes so fast. Megan Collins, of course, is a pop culture anthropologist. Admittedly, you don't have like a formal art background, but I'm beyond excited to hear your thoughts on this book. So first, welcome. And let's, I guess, just jump into what are your thoughts on the book?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've loved this series so much. And this was one of my favorite books that we've read. You really knocked it out of the park this summer in general with all the recommendations. I loved all of them, 5 stars across the board. But this one, I feel like I would have read like in my everyday life. And I just thought it was in addition to loving the content, it was just so fun to read. Bianca Bosker, the author, is funny and insightful, and she's got a journalism background, and like it shows. And it was just such a good book. And yes, it's about the art world, but I think because she, like me, does not come from an art background and just came at it with like, I want to learn, which like is also kind of how I came at it. It was like very accessible to me, and I loved it from start to finish.
Yay, I'm so glad. I very much was like with all of these book choices, they just kind of felt right. Like I'm very much vibes first person, but I love that like by the end of the summer, like especially even the order, I'm like, this fits together so well. And that
Yes.
this book, yeah, I completely agree with sort of the gem of all of them because it kind of tied in the cultural parts and then the benefits of like doing art. And I know she opens up the book talking about her grandma's carrots. And I knew I was going to like this book because it like almost made me weepy hearing about the carrot story. And it's funny because she positioned herself as like, I'm a novice, I don't know anything. But in the first like pages of the book, she exactly captured what art is about. But yeah, it's a fantastic book. So I'm curious, like you said you would have picked this up on your own. Like, is it the journalist perspective? Is it the like, what even is the art world? Like, what would have drawn you into this book?
Yeah, I think the journalist perspective and also her book Corked was one that has also been recommended to me. And now that I've read this and really liked her writing style, I think I'll definitely be picking that up. But I like the kind of position she took of like a lot of journalism comes with this critical distance of like, I'm over here and I'm this objective observer and I'm going to report back what I see and very factual. And I like how she was able to walk the line between that and being immersed in it, because that's kind of what I like to do in my research as well. It's like, yeah, you can read a secondary account of someone like taking you high level through this, or you can go and see and talk to people yourself. And so I really like that it was essentially like an observational research study paired with actual research and actual journalism. And yeah, I just thought it was a really, really good way into the art world.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, observational research. It definitely had like Jane Goodall vibes in that way, and I loved it.
Yes.
To briefly overview, in case someone hasn't read the book, they maybe aren't going to get to it, and that's totally fine. Yeah, so she's a journalist, and I will say, as someone who's married to a journalist, like it's great. It's great to be led through it, but the like incessant, like, well, why is that? Well, why is that? It's funny because like it is a distilled version of like what me and my partner are always doing, which is like I've vibed my way into like, well, this is how it's done. Like, this is what I picked up on. This is how you do the art world. And then Lincoln, who's very like, okay, well, why is that? What purpose does that serve? Who said that? Who made that rule? And so having it's like almost like catharsis to have it written out in a book. But she goes through all of these different aspects of the art world through different people's careers. So a big chunk of the beginning of the book is her working with Jack, who I don't want to make a value judgment because it's mostly boring, but he's really interesting because Lincoln read the book and he was like, he couldn't stand him. But I was, as an artist, grateful that he was so transparent, because it's one of those things where like if you don't know the unwritten rules or the cultural norms, like even it just feels like merciful if someone just lets you in. And I think that's a real testament to the emotional part of the art world, which is this like feeling forever left out kind of aspect of it if you aren't sort of more, I don't know, brought into it in a more formal way. Like Jack was from generational money, and his parents, I think, supported him as he was running this like, art gallery that they weren't sure exactly how it was profitable. It doesn't sound like it maybe was profitable per se, but as an artist who's navigated this, I remember feeling grateful for him. But she goes through all the different careers. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on Jack and the interactions with him.
Yeah. So, well, I actually, before I answer that, wanted to ask you a question because, like, it kind of ties into what I was going to say about Jack. Is like, I'm curious how true this, like, that was something when I was reading this book. I was like, I want to hear from Sari how true this is to her experience. Specifically, like, this idea of like the art world being kind of like, especially the fine art world, because that's another thing I feel like I've come to this from a very like actual paint on canvas place, you know what
Yeah.
I mean? And less of like the art as the commercial place. So I'm curious, as someone who's obviously doing both, how true this book rang to your experience in the art world.
Yes, to be very short, incredibly true.
Okay.
So I always am careful though, because I work with artists, and not everyone, the art world, I'll describe it like this. It's this huge term.
Hmm.
Jack kept saying the art world is small. And that's true, but also the act of making something and selling it to someone, like, congrats, you're part of the art world. Like, the art world can just be sort of commerce, small scale. You appreciate going to your local gallery. Like, that is, I don't gatekeep. That is part of the art world. But this
Hmm.
more formal, like, especially when you get to this like secondary market, these blue chip galleries, absolutely, it's like that. There's a relishing of keeping people out kind of mentality. Like, I have to navigate my career knowing that I am breaking rules. Like, my visibly trying to make money through my social media platform, like that is in a lot of ways keeping me out of the art world. So if anyone's
Hmm.
listening and they're like, okay, well, I need these rules elaborated on more, there's a really good book called, oh goodness, it's by Magnus Riesch, and it's a book based in research. How to be a successful artist. Very forthcoming title. Um, but he talks about, like, in the beginning of the book, how like if you haven't made it to this particular tier of art gallery by your 10th attempt at an art gallery, statistically your career is over. And that's because you haven't been given the proper credentials, cachet, context to be allowed in. You haven't proved yourself. And I'm like past that point. Like, but you can't, like, just because the art world is, like, I think, broken, insular, quite a bit about money laundering more than anything. Not entirely. I think there's good parts to it too. But, a flaw of it are those things. Like, you can't see yourself out and be like, all right, guess it's not for me. Like, I think sometimes people sticking around and breaking the rules, but still being there anyways, is like its own minor form of protest. At least that's what I tell myself to sleep well at night. And that's how I deal with it because it is the Jack episode was cathartic because it rang true, but then you sort of are like sad about it at the same time.
Yeah, totally. And that's kind of what one of my kind of not critiques, but one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading is like this is very New York. Like the and especially like the Jack of it all. And like I was like, how much of this is the New York art world versus like the art world at large? Because I was seeing so many parallels even to like what I do, because like as like a thought worker, it's kind of nebulous of like, what is it that you actually or what value are you actually providing? And there are people like the Jacks who are like, this is a great money making opportunity if you know the right people, if you know the right rules. And so they navigate it kind of that first. And there's value to that. But I also think like he was so focused on the game of it all that he didn't even care about the art of it all. And he was like, she was pointing out how he was always contradicting himself. And like there was no actual philosophy or values behind anything he was doing. He just wanted to be successful in the art game. And so I obviously I also hated Jack. Like I agree with Lincoln.
Yeah.
I think he was like a type of person I've come across a lot where essentially they're like a grifter, but because they are very like socially graceful and know all of the rules, nobody points them out as a grifter, but like the end of the day, they're just a very elegant con artist. And that's how I felt about Jack.
Interesting. I'm going to chew on that. That's really fascinating. Yeah. No, I mean, I think one of the quotes I had, I think from I think of chapter 3, so definitely a Jack episode, was about the concept of pure and like the cachet of it all. So I think this is a quote. I take the worst notes. Anyways, pure generally required a high wire act of accruing cachet, then gradually monetizing it in a way that appeared accidental, but was, of course, exceedingly calculated. First of all, her writing, chef's kiss, like it was just so fun to read. But man, if that didn't get at exactly what it feels like, there's this thing where, um, so a lot of my like art world success, again, art world, I'm using it largely, uh, was a byproduct of my naivety. I sort of had an amazing painting professor who sort of said, if you make good art, and he had strict standards of good art, it had to be authentic, you had to work at it, um, that the right people will show up and come. And I will say that that has been my North Star guiding point in my art career. But, I sort of made the mistake of showing up on social media, and I made like one new piece of art every day. And I did that for years and years. And it felt very like congruent with my working class background of like, just work really, really hard if you want something. If you work hard, you'll get it. And obviously I've deconstructed that a little bit in my life. But it had worked for me up to that point. And I had it pointed out to me by a collector that that wasn't a good look because it didn't allow enough room for scarcity and like cool factor. She didn't say cool factor. She did say scarcity, but the vibe was very much like you look like you're trying too hard, which is, it's one of those like when she said that in there, it just like, yes, basically to your point, like it is like so much of that first part and like what Jack was espousing is like incredibly spot on in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is also something that I think this was in the last book we read by W. David Marks that I highlighted that I've kind of grown frustrated with is like people see other people like what Jack is doing is he is basically looking to replicate the success of previous artists. Like he's like this is what they've done historically and this is what has worked for them. But there's correlation does not prove causation. And so like the idea that somebody was successful because there was scarcity to their work, like maybe that tends to be true for certain reasons, but it's like when you try so hard to kind of force an outcome and force kind of a persona, I think you lose some of the authenticity of like what makes things special. And even like this is something like that I've come across as someone who is a thought worker, which I think is like similar to art, where it's like you have a talent for something and then you like are able to make that into products that people want to buy and sell. And then people see that there's value in that. But in order to create value, you have to tell people what that value is. And this is the context that Jack is talking about. Like they went to this school, they did that. And I think that we're at this place where like just because all of the people in the past, that was their context, does not mean that that's like what it takes to be a successful artist. And I feel like I've seen people like try to replicate kind of my quote unquote process
Mhm.
and not have the same outcome. And they're kind of like questioning why. And it's like, because it's not an exact science, there is a bit of me in there that like you're not going to be able to replicate just by going through the same steps I did. You're not going to get to the same outcome. So I think like the art world has commodified the process of being an artist as an individual. And Jack was saying, here's how that has happened. Here's how that has been commodified. But I think at the end of the day, that's antithetical to what art is because it's supposed to be always changing and evolving and pushing boundaries. And so I thought that like the Jack piece coming first was a really good way in to talk about like how art has become such a commodity and that might be actually eating at what makes it special at the end. But that's the reality of where we're at. And this is the lens through which everything is going to be judged at the end of the day.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. And I think your insight there is really helpful. I remember with the our episode on the culture, status and culture book, you brought up a good point about like convention and how like people who try to predict things often get really hung up on convention. And like the part that they're missing is the ability to be creative and how you look forward. And I feel like it's really spot on that you're making that here because it's, I one of your biggest strengths is that you're incredibly good at making predictions. And so I wonder if like watching Jack take in all this like data about convention and like how it works and the rules, and then not be able, unlike a real artist, in my opinion, to like take that and then synthesize it into something new or future or better or
Yes.
different, just continues to like almost narrow down because of that knowledge of convention, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes, totally. And then beyond like Jack's approach, I also think that like in these spaces where like kind of there's like a creative whose work is being bought and sold, that there are people like Jack who, in addition to just being kind of like their thinking isn't correct, then like become abusive. Like when he like locked her in the wall and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Like that, so they were like putting art together and he essentially hazed her and he would always be commenting on her how her outfits weren't cool enough. Like there's something there about like a power dynamic and like wanting to belittle people that I'm like shows me that Jack did not come to this field because he cares about art or like furthering it, but because he saw an opportunity to grift and also exert power over people by holding the thing that they wanted most. Like, I'm in between you and that thing. I am the gatekeeper between the thing that you want and like getting it. And I think industries like this are like ripe for this type of exploitation and abuse. And I was worried that that was going to be the whole book.
Yeah.
And I was
Yeah.
really
Oh my
glad when
gosh.
she got away from
It's a
him and
hard
like,
read. Yeah.
yeah, and got to other places because that's also something I've experienced and seen
Yeah.
like people whose talent is manipulation of other people see you have a talent for something and they kind of are like, try to manipulate you into using your talent to then manipulate others. And
Mhm.
so it's really something that runs rampant in LA, in the art world, it sounds like, and just any creative field where like kind of the output's kind of nebulous. I think you find a lot of the Jack types. And I'm glad that we got to see some other types of artists and like
Yeah. Be a
other
hard read
art
if it was
dealers.
just various versions of Jack the entire time. I mean, that's why I feel like as an artist, I have to very much unplug from a lot of that. Like Lincoln really likes reading like ArtNet and all that stuff. And I will peruse, especially if there's like a cultural relevant aspect. But like when it comes to like Christie's market and stuff, I have to like
Yeah.
very filter out. But getting
Have
back
you
to what you just
seen?
said, oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you go first. I'll say this after.
No, I just wanted to kind of basically emphasize what you just said, but the way I always like kind of mentally play that game of like is I feel like a lot of power structures hide behind the idea of objectivity versus subjectivity. And I remember there was that Minnesota research on like white supremacy culture, and it's such a good job at like carving out the flaws in our power structure. And so I look at things through that lens. And one of them is
Mhm.
sort of imposing objectivity where there isn't necessarily. And to kind of elaborate on that and rally it into the Jack character is I have experienced and witnessed people who like when they see talent and kind of to the rest of the book, Bianca sort of argues that there are some aspects of art that are objectively good or beautiful or appealing. And it's a very neoliberal take to say, no, 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 beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's like this conversation that happens in the art world. And it was intentionally in a way to sort of affront these power structures that held on to objectivity. But to your point, having someone like Jack basically hide abusive behavior behind the like objectivity for me, subjectivity for you, or vice versa. I'm getting that flipped, is absolutely a power move that I see over and over and over in the art world.
Totally. And I think it's also one of the pitfalls because it's like if someone talented ends up with like Jack as their first foray into this, then that could be the end of their career, you know? If like
Mhm.
statistically what you're saying is like you get 10 chances, like, and then you're done, you know? So like, it's something that I think goes across industries, but it was interesting to me to see how it came to life in the art world, you know, and how it's kind of
Absolutely.
like and I think that's part of why it's becoming this bigger thing for like money laundering and all of that, because like that's how you can make it seem valuable to these billionaires who are at the end of the day. I think what this book showed is like one of the target audiences for art at the end of the day is like these big money clients, not like the masses.
Hmm.
I found it really interesting when she talked about the Met and how there was like a attempt to make art more accessible by allowing everyone into the Met, and then people were complaining that like people from lower classes didn't know how to act in the Met, and so then they had to like educate them on like, you know, no shouting, no running, no talking, like those types of things so that they could act more high class. And I was like, to me, that's not making the art accessible.
Yep.
Like making the art accessible would have been taking the art and putting it in those spaces where the people could act the way that they want to act while still interacting with the art, not being like, in order, you're allowed to come here, but you must do things the way that we want you to do them. Like I was like, do they not see this disconnect? You know what I mean?
No, I really don't think they do. I think they're like, oh no, you're allowed in here, just behave this different way. But they don't realize that the requirement to behave that weeds people out. Like I know
Yes.
I grew up with people who were like, my family, for example, like we weren't necessarily the like NASCAR, poor white people. We were, loved Nova, PBS, like science, like we would wonder and, things like that. Like we were, math and all that stuff. But art was kind of like a hard no for us. Like we were artsy, we solved problems, we made stuff with our hands, but we felt very unwelcomed by the art world. And I think a lot of that it actually connected with me when I read this book was because like, yeah, I mean, culturally, like there's loudness, there's rowdiness, there's silliness, there's like I don't hold, like if I don't like it, I'm not going to hold it up in this high regard. Like I will, I'm not going to destroy these pieces. But like when you sort of culturally don't allow people in, like it creates a harder line than I think people realize that it makes.
Yeah, totally. And even like that knowing like sport, for example, tennis, and I don't know if this is true, but one of the old wives' tales is that like the scoring is so complicated because they didn't want everyone to figure out how to play. Like they wanted it to be like, no, you don't know the rules. So that's part of why scoring is so complicated. And a lot of the sport, there's a lot of these like etiquette things that like I grew up just like knowing. And like I remember playing with like someone who hadn't grown up playing tennis and like with their family, and the way that they were just like doing all of these, like we were on a tennis court by ourselves, there was no one else around, but like the embarrassment I felt when they were like making all of these weird mistakes of like shouting or like talking during other people's playing or just like things that I'm like, you just don't do that. That's just not done. And like, obviously, I didn't say anything. I just like recognized it in myself, like, why do I care so much about this right now? Like,
Yeah.
and it was just so drilled into me, like, this is not how you behave on a tennis court, that like I took what they were doing as like an actual affront. You know,
Oh
like,
no.
obviously, I like did this was all internal. I did not
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
say anything to these people, but I was just like, this is so weird that even me, like someone who doesn't think of themselves as a snob, was like having these feelings and emotions of like, this is not how things are done. You guys don't get it. Like, act better. And I was like, I can only imagine how like it went in the Met when they had like all of these people around. If that's how I felt playing with people I like know and liked and they weren't acting correctly, you know? So I almost think that even just like furthers the divide of like, well, we invited them in and they didn't know how to act. So what do you want us to do? We tried. You know what I mean?
Yep. Oh, that's such a good point. Well, we invited them. And that's the funny thing is like I have interviewed people who like have sort of museum academic backgrounds. And I still don't entirely know how to articulate my way through it. I'm like figuring it out. But
Hmm.
that's a lot of it is like, well, we in these low income areas, like we allow free entry. And it's like it's something that I've kind of I think I'm figuring out right now is like people sometimes don't understand the cultural thing that can come with class too. Like there's
Hmm.
like the of course like needs being met aspect of it, but then
Hmm.
there's the like you don't you like the convention like you were just saying like the convention leaves people out. Like people do pick up on like subtlety and subtext. And,
Yes.
like for example, there's a museum in Bentonville, which is like in the Ozarks. It's Walmart country. It's actually where Walmart puts a lot of its money, but it's the largest collection of American art in the country. And there's always, I've heard these jokes so many times, but people are like, oh, they've got the art hostage because it's in the middle of nowhere and like no one there enjoys it and they don't have culture and things like that. And the entry is free, and yet it does have pretty low attendance because yeah, it's also less dense of a place, but it's used against those people that the people from the Ozarks are dumb, ignorant, uncultured because they're not going into these places. So you're so right. It's a cycle that sort of enforces itself. I think it's called like a positive cycle, right? So
Yeah.
it's incredibly, yeah,
Yeah.
good
It's like
observation.
they're reinforcing their prejudice. And I also think this made me think about the distinction between arts and crafts and like how craft is basically like that's something that I feel like being friends with you, I've been like, all crafting is art. Like,
Yes.
we don't call it art, but it's like, it's art. And like, even like the distinction is built in like, so the racism and, not racism, sorry. What's the word I'm looking for?
Sexism?
Misogyny,
Misogyny. Yeah, yeah,
sexism.
yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
sexism of just like, what we see the work that women do as like not as valuable. And so crafting is not seen as art. And, but like, put a urinal on its side and that's art, because it's like conceptual and you're buying the idea and all of that. And so I thought that that was something that was running throughout this book that she didn't address as head on of like this distinction between arts and crafts. But I also actually read a romance novel yesterday called Thank You for Listening. And in this book, that was one of the themes of like the difference between romance novels and women's fiction. And like they were like, at the end of the day, it's just a marketing thing of like, like
Yeah.
to help it reach the correct audience. And I feel like that's the same exact thing with arts and crafts. By having craft in this category over here, it kind of protects the art category and keeps it for these billionaires and things that like the jacks of the world are trying to get in with.
Yes. Yeah. No, and you're totally right. I think it's also that the writing world is incredibly gendered also. And I remember doing a book cover and it was an author and it was like a comedy sort of book. And the initial pitch had like pink in it and there were some things and they picked, examples of my work that were very girly and pinky. And there was like a whole process to it. But by the time you get to the final review, the author comes back and like makes notes on it. And there was basically like a start over kind of thing because there was so much pink and girliness to it. And my way of grappling with it is always trying to empathize instead of getting frustrated. Anyways,
Mm-hmm.
and I was thinking like this is a woman writer debut novel, and she already comes from a comedy space, which is another example of like serious versus humor, kind of has its own dichotomy. But I think you get this anxiety of like I don't want to be perceived as a woman writer, or like that like fear of like the misogyny built into writing. And I think that was what I was kind of dealing with in that moment. At least that's my guess. Who knows?
Yeah.
But absolutely. I mean, you see that in writing, you see that in art and that distinction. And it's funny because like tying in the last book we read, I remember there was a point where they were talking about like the benefits of like your interior space, and like women
Mm-hmm.
typically are in charge of that work, like of decorating the house and curating the space and cultivating a vibe. It even seems kind of like silly and ephemeral because it's such a like Gen Z thing too, of like making your space beautiful. And anyways, and to think about how in that book they were able to quantify how impactful it is for our health and for all of these like more male centric metrics, the science of it. And then for us to be like, well, that's just like homekeeping, that's craft, that's like its second, that's not real art. It's just like it's so funny because even when we have the data to back up why it is incredibly relevant, we still have this push because of convention to say like it doesn't matter, it's secondary, let's protect the real art. So dumb.
No, totally. Even like romance makes up so much of the book industry, and it's not taken seriously just because of this convention of like, it's romance and it's just smut and fluff and who cares. And I have been working on my pick me tendencies. I was like raised to be a pick me and like realized that was not the way. And so I've been like actively trying to like work on some of these things and like my not like other girls itis, I call it. And so one of those has been like reading romance novels because I realized like I had that. Like I've always seen being a reader as part of my identity. And I've not wanted to be like, I don't read those kind of books though. Like I don't read romance though. I read real serious women's fiction book. And so like once I was like, no, that's sexist and I need to stop, I was like, I need to like I'm reading romance this year. And what I found that has been interesting is like due to the gatekeeping of like this is a space for women and not just women, but women who are romantic and
Mhm.
optimistic and like want to find love. I feel like I've read some of the most like nuanced,
Mhm.
insightful portrayals of like other things just because I feel like it's a safe space, if that makes sense, where you like, these readers aren't going to be nitpicking you and being like, well, that's not feminist. Or like the book that I read yesterday, like, I was like, she should cut off her dad. He's clearly a narcissist. And like, it's like, but I was like, but this is a romance. Like, she's not
Mhm.
going to cut her dad off. So, like, throughout this book, she's like interacting with her dad and they're having all these deep discussions and stuff. And I'm like, we wouldn't have had this in a women's fiction book because everyone would just like, why are you even talking to him? You know what I mean? So like it's interesting how like romance is like kind of a safe space for women, not just to like read about like sex and love and dating, but also just read about like other emotions that they're having in other relationships and unpacking those because the gatekeeping thing there is like you have to be a person who like is open-hearted. You know what I mean? In order to read these types of books. And I feel like that's the danger with the art world being so like at the end of the day, the metric to your point is like, will a billionaire want to hang this in their house to impress their friends? That's kind of a shitty metric to be building art against, I think, personally.
Absolutely. And it creates, again, a perfect space for those like backing up of conventions that, I mean, and also like the whole idea of like sticking with convention, like to be so adherent to convention is to like say that the culture up until this point has your seal of approval. I'm always like
Yes.
baffled by it because I'm like, don't we want to like pivot away from this? Like by opening up the definitions and allowing, yeah, like approaches that, I mean, to your point about the romance novel is a great one because it's like there's this push to be sort of the ideal like feminist in these novels, like you have to be like a perfect role model, and like what if you aren't, and like what are the nuances
Mm-hmm.
that happen with that, especially in fiction. Like my big take is like in fiction most bets are off, but in real life, like let's hold people to higher standards. Like that's my
Yes.
personal who cares, but
Yeah.
fiction is a great place for that to sort of happen. And when we have these conventions and rules and this sort of power dynamic between objectivity and subjectivity that sort of are rampant in these places that we've deemed as real art, we do sort of end up limiting ourselves. It's a good point. Like, is the answer like that we let everything be art, or is it that we just like personally know that there's not a hierarchy and navigate and continue? I don't know. I don't know that I have the answer, but that's an interesting, really interesting point to bring up.
Yeah. I don't know if I have the answer either because I think that's something I've been thinking about too. Like what I see in the creative space online is that people are craving some sort of recognition for doing quality work, even if it isn't what is most like rewarded in the algorithm. So it's like, and I feel like I'm looking like, oh, that's what the Oscars were for. It's like those were the movies that aren't going to make $1 million or $1 billion at the box office, but like they're really good quality wise, like, and a jury of your peers saying like, hey, we love this, but then obviously that becomes like corrupt and people then use it to like enforce convention rather than explore it. But I do think there is kind of a human desire for like a jury of people who have like been anointed as like special to say we think you're special. So it's like I'm not like blow it all up, none of it
Yeah.
matters, because it's like it does. But I just think that like, and this is something I have been thinking about, but also have not landed the plane on, of just like at a certain point, the marketing becomes the thing that you're paying for. It becomes the product. And even this is kind of something that like Jack was getting at in the book with like ideas, and like you're kind of buying and selling ideas as opposed to like a beautiful piece of ornamental art to hang in your home. Like there was that one point in the book where they sold a mural. And
Yeah.
so she has to paint over a mural and she's like, but like, why am I painting over this artist's work? And because like they were, what they actually were buying was the instructions to recreate the mural. And I was like, that blew my mind. I did
Oh
not know
yeah.
that was a thing that happened. And I
Oh
was
yeah.
like, this is so strange. You're literally buying like the idea of an art piece that could be created. And it's like, it was giving NFT, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
And I was like, I see why,
Non-fungible. Yeah.
yeah,
OG
I see
non-fungible.
why
Yeah.
people thought that NFTs would be a thing because all these billionaires are essentially already buying NFTs. Like,
And no,
but
watching the NFT thing as someone who's like relatively recently just graduated from art school and having learned all this stuff, I was like, this is just like internet bros like learning the value of concept, but I digress.
no, literally, I was like, I remember I was working at YouTube at the time and we got like a thing that they were like, Gen Z loves NFTs. And I got the chance to be like, hold on there. No, that's not true, Ellen. And like I actually made the CEO at the time, Susan, rest
Yeah.
in peace, Susan.
Yeah, I know.
Um, she was working on she's working on a release to talk about NFTs. And I was like, they cannot say that NFTs are the future. Like, do they not see that a brand like YouTube saying, like, yeah, we believe in NFTs is an
Yeah.
endorsement that could then like further this industry that has a lot of critique. So we basically had to throw together a thing really fast. Like NFTs are kind of iffy. We don't actually know. Also, millennials are way more into them than Gen Z are. And so she like her statement on NFTs was much more softened than it would have been. It was like, we'll see. You know, it wasn't like,
Yeah.
yeah, we're diving in. It was like, we're thinking about it. And I feel really proud of that because I
Oh,
was
you
like,
should
I
be.
feel like I helped like NFTs not be legitimized because they were a scam.
100%. And you know what's so funny about that is I remember, I don't know if it had been about the same time, but Instagram's guy, what's his name? Masari?
Adam Asseri.
Yeah. He had one of his little talks where he basically said the solution to us not paying creators is that you just do NFTs. And all of us artists who are like trying to sell like these, like we all were just like, what is going on? So no, I feel like you absolutely dodged like, oh, that's, yeah, NFTs are embarrassing. Let's
Yeah.
move
My
on.
favorite was when the TikTok sound took off when it was like, it's like an NFT you can hold.
A
Like,
100%.
I
No,
love that so much.
that's why like it pains me. The world just needs like a good arts education background. Like that's why I think like
Yeah.
SEMA is doing like the Lord's work because
Yes.
that's what the internet needs so
Yeah.
desperately bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to okay, so let's pivot from Jack because he basically like if
Yes.
nothing else, like if you're reading this book and you want to kind of know what the lay of the land of the art world is in a way that's just like watching people be people, like read the Jack episodes. Like I wish I would have had that insight much earlier in my career. But she moves through the rest of the book in a way that I think is really like beautiful. So I really like the chapters where she's working with the artist, and I'm very curious what you think about those chapters. Julie, oh gosh, I forget her name. I actually followed her, but before this, but Julie with the painter, definitely
Hmm.
worth checking out her work too. I'll put some like in the show notes of this. But what were your thoughts about yeah, the actually working with an artist part?
Yeah, I mean, she honestly, I feel like reminded me a lot of you.
Oh,
I was like, you know what I
that's
mean?
kind.
And I liked how she really brought her to life like as a character. Like I was like I felt like she was tangible, you know what I mean? In a way that like Jack was such a villain that it was like, oh, it was good to have such that counterbalance of like an artist who cares about the work but is also like here's all of the shit that I have to deal with and here's like you know when I like and I think she told a story about her like wrestling with a piece like she was like trying to get the right color and like was like oh this just isn't working today and like I was just really glad we got that view because that's more of like my view of art has been is like
Yeah.
watching you paint and what like actually painting and like how it is kind of like it's a practice and it's like something that you do and like the labor behind it, not just like the concept and like can you trick a billionaire into thinking that this is worth however much money? You know what I mean?
Right.
So I thought that it was a really good counterbalance to the other chapters and I thought she was super interesting.
Yeah, no, I was so glad that was in there because that was the part through the like I think I skipped a part, but she was selling art at some point. She was working with Jack, and it was so refreshing to have her work with an artist. And like even the idea of
Hmm.
like you walk through the world as if everything could be art, like that is like kind of my like mantra with all of my art.
Hmm.
You know, I mention it all the time, but like my background is I grew up very low income. Like part of that existence is that your aesthetic needs are never catered to. Like they are the most afterthoughtiest afterthought. So you grow up in these like, for me, ugly peri-urban sort of environments. Just you know, government housing, like no one cared about anything looking nice. You know, and but you're still a human and you still have this desire to see and witness things that feel special or novel or beautiful or whatever you interesting, whatever. And so I feel like I developed my eye like kind of just like, I don't know, Ninja Warrior style, like, just like developing it despite nothing being there, really having to push myself. And it's something that I've carried with me kind of into my artwork. And it's why I like to teach art to other people, because it allows you to see things in a way where you're doing lots of great stuff. You're like checking your biases, but also everything can be art. And I think that that's like, I even just recently I had a post where I painted like just random stuff, and someone was like, "Oh my gosh, I was just cleaning out my bathroom and I had all this junk in there." And the tone was very like this is silly that you're making it kind of. And I think I commented back, like I was like, well, that's a testament that everyone's life has like great fodder for artwork. Like we're all,
Hmm.
everything could be artwork. And I think that's the specialness of art. And I'm glad that they captured that. And she did a great job writing about it with the artist in that like moment of her working as a studio assistant.
Yeah, I completely agree. I actually highlighted this. Julie had this openness to being moved by things she saw, read, and watched that made me feel as if I'd been experiencing culture through earmuffs and an eye mask. And this is like kind of what we were talking about, and like awe being like something that's so important to just like the human experience. And I think that, and this is something I've experienced like since I've started painting, is like art and like being an artist beyond like the actual practice of it, the mindset is being open to being awed by things and being like, wow, isn't that so cool and beautiful and like interesting to look at, that I think we are being trained out of due to advertising, because that's something that like that she talks about in this book, like visual literacy, and something that I've been trying to articulate about Gen Z is that they are incredibly visually literate in social media. So
Yeah.
like they are just like picking up on things so quickly, but I also think they're tuning things out to this point that she said about like earmuffs and an eye mask. Like I think you kind of have to tune out so much of the stimulus of the world in order to exist in it, because it is so stimulating right now, that I think it's like such a skill to be an artist and like be open to that in this day and age.
Yeah, it's a skill, and it's a skill that anyone can develop. It's so, I think that's why it's like I really wish everyone developed some kind of a creative practice. I think visual art, I can obviously attest to it, but I'm sure there's a musician out there who's yelling at me for not picking up an instrument. So, anyways, but I know my bias, but it's, I mean, like, well, even okay, the concept of bias, this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. I mean, as a painter and a painting instructor, like one thing I'm always sort of baffled by my own, and I do this every day, but like you look at something and you swear it's one way, and then you mix the color or you do the thing or you make it and you're like, you're wrong. You're wrong so much of the time. And I think even just like, and I'm teasing out one example, but like even just existing in a world where you consume news and media and advertising, where you like you juggle between the sensation of awe and wonder, but then also being so aware of how you get it wrong a lot, and like how baffling biases can be. I think that's just such a like, even if you never make a good piece of work, and I'm using air quotes here, like even if you never produce anything that is amazing, just the act of that, like looking and awe and like coming into confronting your biases over and over is so valuable that it's like I think we're going to look back and this is going to be such a dark age for us, the fact that we aren't kind of all of us participating in something creative. I really think it's,
Yeah.
I feel like I'm on a soapbox, but like we should all be making stuff.
No, I think stay on your soapbox. As a trend forecaster, I see it happening. One of my favorite influencers the other day posted Claudia Saluski. If you're listening and looking for more creators to follow, I love her vlogs on YouTube. And I think she's just very cool. And she posted that she was like, "Oh yeah, but by the way, I oil paint." And she's like painted this beautiful photo. And I was reading the comments and people were like, yeah, everybody know, like if you've been here a while, you knew that she used to paint this, she used to paint that. And I was like, fact that Claudia Saluski, who's like a trendsetty, cool LA girl, is like, we're painting now, girlies. I was like, yes, like all the girlies are gonna start painting. So it's happening. But what you just said about bias, like I feel like just clicked for me of like how much that is the act of painting is like confronting your biases about like literally your brain and your eyes are conspiring against you
A
to help
hundred
to
percent.
have you see like something that isn't there or like intuit something. And she talks about this like she says, if you want to feel like you possess heretofore undiscovered superpowers, I highly recommend looking at art with Rebecca. Did I realize how miraculous it was that I could tell Jesus's pale ankles from the peach and gold tiled floor behind them? Our brain's ability to know that the texture of the floor is all one thing is actually really, really sophisticated because it's broken up into all of these patches. And like she goes into like the visual tricks that painters can play on the brain and stuff. And this is actually something that I've been raising caterpillars into butterflies, and I like have been so like impressed by the visual trickery of caterpillars because it's like the way that they
Have you painted? Yeah, I love
yeah,
it. It's really amazing.
the way that they are, it's like to you can't see them unless you're looking for them. Like, and I'm not even going to be able to describe it correctly, but it's like it's a trick of the eye, the way that they're striped. It's to look like the plant that they like, the shadows coming through, like create, like it's literally to create shadows. And I just have been staring at them like, this is wild. Like they adapted to do camouflage this well. Then they changed it to a whole other creature that adapts to do camouflage in a different plant because butterflies look like falling leaves or like rustling leaves. And I've just been in awe of the caterpillars and the way that they've like use this visual trickery to like survive. And I never thought of it as bias, but like the way that you just described it of like bias is so true. And I also think gives me more empathy for like other types of biases where it's like, no, it's literally your brain giving you shortcuts so that you can navigate through the world without having to take in every single stimulus and think about it. But I do think this act of confronting your biases consistently is becoming more and more important as we live in such an information heavy world.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's, I mean, yeah, 100%. I mean, that's a beautiful story. I love the caterpillars, by the way. That's so cute.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, I mean, the fact that it's like you're using, I mean, I just taught about this. I have a whole art school thing. And one of the things, there's like this, I'll insert it in the show notes, but there's an optical illusion, which optical illusions are just like being confronted with your bias. It's so funny. Like we
Hmm.
like it when it's little, but anyways, but it's a gray rectangle, a skinny gray rectangle, and then there's a gradient of gray behind it. And it's one solid rectangle color, but where it has the dark behind it, it looks lighter to us. And then when it's just, you have to see it. But when you cover up the gray box around it with your hands, it's
Hmm.
obvious that it's one solid color. Like our own senses are just not reliable narrators. And it
Yeah.
just, what it means is you have to sort of be willing to outsource what you know. And I can't remember if it was this book, but I was reading recently about like why we really can't trust pictures and why we have to be like incredibly critical of even like video. Like we're kind of in this age where I think I'm optimistic about it, but there used to be this idea of like if you can see it in photo or in video, that's the truth. And as someone who
Hmm.
wields and deals in photos all day long, pictures, images, two-dimensional pictures, like I know how wrong that can be. Like even if
Hmm.
everything is perfectly right, like it can still be incorrect in so
Hmm.
many different ways. And what's exciting about that is I think we're getting to a place culturally with AI and stuff where we're going to have to start outsourcing what we know solidly into a more of a communal project. And I think that like in the age of energy, okay, but as we develop and evolve, if we choose to do that like in the like ethically and in the right way, like that's very exciting for us that no longer do we have to like prove every one thing to every one person. Like we can sort of collectively, I don't know, I'm getting out a little bit off my rocker here, but I think it's really exciting. I think the idea that like we can confront our biases on a micro level and that can sort of scale up always
Yeah.
gives me sort of chills in a good way that like I have
Yeah.
so much hope. And it's because you see your biases. I don't know. That's
Yeah, and I also think just the normalizing the idea that we all have biases, like that's even something that I feel like in my work that's not art, I always come at like I have bias. I'm a person and this is like I even say this on my podcast a lot, like everything people say, every take, there's projection in that. So you have to like know where your projection is coming from and also everybody's takes can tell you a lot about where they're coming from and what they've read into a situation just based on like their internal biases. And like, I think we're moving towards a culture of like the truth not mattering as much, not because like it doesn't matter and like fake news and that whole realm, but like just because we understand that like we are all having our own experience. So like, yes, maybe that's like what happened, but we have this understanding now that like something can happen and six people can experience that six different ways and both things can be true. And I feel like that's being understood more. Like there's been several conflicts in pop culture lately, like Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, which I feel like a lot of people were like, both things can be true. Like
Yeah,
maybe
that's a
like
good
they
point.
both are at fault here. Like obviously there was a pile on to Blake and like misogyny and all of that, but I do think that like some of the more nuanced critiques out there were like, I think both things are true. I think that this is an interpersonal like drama and like we don't have to take sides. Sabrina Carpenter and Camila Cabello.
Yeah.
Like there's a impulse for people to take sides, but I think like a lot of people are like, I just like hearing both perspectives. And it's very cool to me that two sides can have completely different takes on the situation. Everybody's watching Kevin Can Fuck Himself on Netflix, which is same thing. One's a sitcom, one's a drama, and it's like the same story told in two different modes, and how that feels so very different to each of those characters, even though technically the same thing is happening. I could go on. There's so many other examples.
Totally.
There's Hallie Kate and Sophia LaCourte. Like, so I
Yeah.
just think that we are moving away from this idea of like right, true, correct to okay, but at the end of the day, we're humans, we're flawed, we're not robots. Like there is AI and they'll do that, but we're humans having a human experience. And I think that's part of why Sabrina's album is striking a chord because, and this is something she said, she's like, I know I'm making mistakes, but like I'm 25, I'm gonna make mistakes. And this song is about me singing about mistakes while I'm making them. And I think like people just like who aren't getting it aren't like at that level of self-awareness where it's like, yeah, I know I'm like this guy's rebound and he has a kid and he's like not proven to have a great track record, but like I'm doing it anyways. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I
And
no, that's what you just said. I just underline that. And like what I was trying to say is like you said it so much better, so much more eloquently. But yes, yes, absolutely. Moving away from this sort of more like, yeah, right, truth versus not truth, like right versus wrong, finding sort of the nuance in that. And not nuance in like sort of a cop-out way. Like unfortunately, that is a thing that happens, but like nuance in a like yeah, you can write a wonderful album where you're not being the hero, and that can be okay. It reminds me of like one little
mm-hmm,
anecdote I'll throw in here. So I had this again really amazing art education with this great professor who sort of exposed us to these ideas and themes and precedents within the art world that allowed a lot of nuance. And then I started posting on social media, and I realized
where
I did an
nuance goes
image
to die.
nuance especially like, and I agree with you that it actually we are I think hitting in some ways like a breakthrough moment with that, and it obviously fits in spurts. But
Mm-hmm,
I did a painting of Tiger King because everyone was just doing all things Tiger King, and I had like an image with it where like anyways but yeah, but so people were like, are you platforming Tiger King? And it wasn't meant to be that because the context was it was a mugshot, so it's like I was trying,
mm-hmm,
and I sort of had to be like, not, I'm not going to out, I'm not going to win over the internet. So I did apologize and take it down. But
mm-hmm,
it's one of those things where I thought about it ever since of like this idea of sort of publishing and nuance and like, your audience, because you have this thing called like the aesthetic triad, which is like just a framework. It's not like the
mm-hmm.
framework, but it's that when you look at something critically, because obviously I don't need to explain this to you, but like to anyone listening, like criticism doesn't just mean the colloquial, like I'm saying something bad about it. Like it actually just means the ability to look at something through multiple different points of view. So like you have your own, like, I feel this way, I like this, I don't like this. But it's equally outweighed by, and the artist meant this, and this is the context that that lives in. And then the audience views it as this, and this is the context that they live in. And I think what's exciting about all that is I hope we're moving to a place where we can have that different frameworks to appreciate art and just content and writing and people expressing themselves and drama and all of it, I think deserves the kind of nuance that sometimes fine art exclusively has.
Yeah, I've been thinking about how the FYP has actually been kind of challenging people to understand nuance a little bit more. Because it's like I feel like the way context is arrived at on TikTok is like interesting because you're on the FYP. You know everyone's on their FYP. So the idea is everyone's getting one video from you. You know that this is like going to the FYP. However, the rest of your account serves as quote unquote context. So it's like you can like also you can do the caption whatever, but I've been seeing a lot of lately of like people posting like rage bait, and it's like very clearly rage bait, but like it's not being received that way. And then there will be and like I'll be like this seems like it's rage bait. I'll go to their account and they're clearly trying to go viral. And then like I like will look through the comments and someone will be like, can you guys not see that this is like a joke. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And they'll have liked that comment. And so it's kind of just like this idea of like, well, whatever. If you guys are having a reaction, I've done my job. If you don't pick up on the context is there for you. And it's not my fault you're having like the reaction that you are. In fact, I'm just going to ride that to success, you know?
Interesting. Yeah, it's almost like the responsibilities being a little bit more shared where it was. And I think,
Yes.
something you brought up a minute ago brings us to this point, which is advertising. So when I was in college, I remember probably about as close to having like and this is the boogeyman moment. My entire arts education was when we brought up advertising. And it's often used as sort of a foil against fine art. Like fine art really doesn't try to intentionally position itself against the masses per se, but
Mm-hmm.
rather the idea that visual communication has to be distilled to, I always call it the greatest common denominator, which is just like
Mm-hmm.
the lowest threshold that we all can kind of understand, and how that, I mean, and I'm careful. There's nuance here. Like, it's not to say that all advertising is bad, but I will say that like that's kind of like the bad guy. And I think with social media, we're introducing maybe a bit of a swing back in a way that is popular to everyone. Because obviously art's been pushing back on it, but art's this tiny little inbred circle.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I don't think the artists intend for that, but gestures towards the book. So, but yeah, I think you're totally right. It's like, I'm going to present this to you, and you have a choose your own adventure that you can go on, which is the fun part of art. But you're totally right. I think it is something that's being introduced to social media where it's like, if you choose to know, like the bean soup thing, like, what,
Mm-hmm.
the person making the content isn't beholden to like feeding you like from their hand, like advertising has been financially incentivized to do since forever,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I have been interested even in like I noticed that TikTok has taken away some of the posters' ability to control the narrative on things and given it
Mhm.
back to the kind of audience and the lowest common denominator. Like taking away pinned comments, for instance.
Yeah, that was a
Like
bummer. Do you know why that happened? Do you have a
I honestly think it was just like to take away some of the narrative power from creators. Like this is honestly my tinfoil hat. Like the government wouldn't do that, kids, but like they have this problem where the government feels like TikTok is a threat to their power. And so I think that pinned comments were a way that people were able to control the conversation and like have more nuanced like discussions. Because I think that a lot of the creators, whether it's true or not, who are having these more nuanced discussions feel like they're being heavily censored and heavily like monitored, and like certain videos don't get as much traction as they should. And I think it's because TikTok is a very powerful message spreader, but I
Mhm.
also think like it's more power like my from the beginning I'm like I think that the Chinese government like knows how powerful TikTok is, but they don't like want it in their country like this
Yeah.
way. So they put it in America to see like, okay, what can this do? And they're studying the algorithm, like kind of using us as like
Yeah.
the I don't want to say like
Guinea
test
pig. Yeah.
subjects, guinea pigs, but I think it's just like we're getting this is new. This like is so new for humanity and like communication. And what I've read of the Chinese government is I just don't see them giving their citizens this unparalleled access to communicating with each other that they've given us in America. And I think it's been huge when you think about how like things have changed so quickly. Um, in such a short period of time. I think some of that is due to TikTok, and a lot of especially people who are existing in feminist spaces say like the ability of women to talk to each other and like tell their stories. And so like even a more sinister read on the art world could be like by taking these people who are like wanting to push culture forward and like change things and change society, and rather than like unleashing them on the masses and like trying to train the masses into nuance, we're going to like confine them to this small world where they're going to be needing to please a handful of billionaires who are the very people who are keeping the system the way it is. I'm like, this can't not be
100%.
completely on accident, you know?
Oh, totally. 100%. I no, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, the idea of it being intentionally, yeah, I mean, Seema has said as much. So Seema is Art Lust is
Love
her
her.
TikTok. I adore her. Definitely follow her. But she does a great job tying everything into like visual literacy, which a lot of times comes back to art and art history. But Yeah, I mean, she says all the time, like people who run galleries and they don't want the masses to like it. It is a very intentional sort of choice, and there's lots of reasons for it. It's the, I think on the worst side, it's the ability to launder money. I mean, you have people who are art appraisers, and this is someone who could come in, look at a piece of work. I mean, even the part with the artist where she got scared that all her stuff was going to the secondary market and the prices were getting jacked up. I mean, the thing is, like, think about you buy a painting for someone for, $1,000, and all of a sudden you could go sell it to the secondary market for $80,000. Like, who
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't be like,
Mm-hmm.
that's life-changing money for most people. Like, that's
Yeah.
you can take a year off of work for that. But
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's that idea that it's just like that small little piece of control. I don't know if this is even a productive thing, but one thing I always think of is I compare visual arts to music a lot, because
Mm-hmm.
music has its financial ability to stay afloat has always had to have one foot in popular culture. It's had
Mm-hmm.
to appeal through radio because of the amount of you can't buy a piece of music. I mean, I guess you can't buy a song like in the more formal sense, like you can a commodity, like a
Mm-hmm.
fungible or like a holdable or whatever piece of artwork, right? Music has always had to, because of that constraint, just market itself a little differently. But they
Yes.
both exist in the concept of like, we don't want to have to always appeal to the masses. There is this underlying hierarchy in this culture of like, if people like it, it's not good kind of thing. But I think in a lot of ways, music is better because it's had to have one foot. I mean, there will always be music that's
Mm-hmm.
like you just don't get it. Like Vox one time years ago did this great. I'll try to link it, but feature on this guy who does like noise music, and like he's untrained, he doesn't know music theory. And I don't know how, I think he's like connected was how he was able to do it, go figure. But he made this like piece of like sound art,
Mm-hmm.
and people rave about it. They're like, this is a work of genius. And then like the artist came out and said that there was a fly on his drum set, and like that's what he was doing. But he gets all this like tales all this time, like credit for being a genius.
Mm-hmm.
And the music has just as much potential for that, but because it's had to stay a little more connected to what people in large scale like, I think it's forced music to be both smart and interesting and push the edge of like cutting edge and interesting. And that spirit never goes away. It's a human thing. But also don't leave everybody out. And I sometimes wish the art world had that, where it's like, I don't know, maybe this is because my work's more mass appeal, who knows? But I think about that a lot. And I thought about it when I was reading this book.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this idea that mass appeal equals bad is not true. And I almost think it's like the opposite. I've been thinking about like everyone wants to go viral. So I'm thinking about like writing a piece like how to go viral. And step one is like your thing has to be good.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, and so I even think like all of this other stuff we talk about, like that's all marketing and like understanding the way humans like to spread their messages. But at the end of the day, you have to come up with something that's good. And so then I was like, okay, well, what does good mean? And I've been thinking about this in terms of Sabrina Carpenter's album. And one thing that pop music does, and everyone's pointing this out, they're like, this song sounds like this song sounds like that song. I'm like, no, that's what pop music does. It
Hmm.
takes what you already know because it sounds familiar. It's not hard for you to think about. It's like you already kind of like it because it's proven success. And then adding new ideas. So she's taken like a lot of classic pop things and pop sounds and added a lot of hyper relevant ideas around decentering men and women and sexuality. And the marriage of that is what has like made something new that's interesting. And like that's what my definition of good is like proven success plus I've added something new that's interesting based on the larger culture at large. Like even if people aren't like this album is resonating me because I'm like thinking about how, men aren't that great. Like it's in there and it's going to resonate with them even if they are not yet able to articulate that. And I think artists are very good at picking up those things and making them into a cohesive narrative. And to your point about to our earlier point about like the marketing becomes the product, that's something I've even been thinking about with like touring. Like when did CDs become a thing that you had to even buy? Was that originally just marketing to go like, hey, listen to this CD so that you can want to go see a show? Like where did
Hmm.
this all come about? And now it's become all about merch. Like all of these vinyls that people are buying, people don't have record players. They're not listening to these vinyls. It's to have like a something physical that you can hold and say like I am believing in this art that this person is creating that's more like conceptual because it's like a concept she's putting out into the world, but they do want to own like pieces of it as a commodity, like you were saying. Like you can't own a song, but like you do want to feel like you can. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that, well, and I almost wonder sometimes if the like appeal to everyone, the marketing, you know, that like mass culture thing, there's like this real resistance to it. And bringing it
Hmm.
back to kind of the jack of it all is it's like the convention. There's always this sort of like, art is better when we can look back at it and like all of these smart people can agree that it's great. And I think it's a real tell that like, that whoever controls the history has the power. And obviously there's a lot of really scary aspects to that. But I think it's like when you're deferring to like, how do you have the best way to co-sign your power or to give yourself the most cachet? It's sort of like looking at something that I think has like past and future relevance. And I think what ends up happening, and I'm saying this as like something that the art world does, and it drives me freaking nuts, but it robs us of like the human moment of all of us enjoying something at the same time. And I think that often gets sort of overlooked because there is such an ability to market on it and capitalize on it
Hmm.
and make money off of it. But they're both ways to make money. I just think one of them is steeped in more like it's a safer bet that the thing that in the past that we liked or this marketing this as something that will go down in history because of XYZ. And it reminds me of specifically kind of my personal thoughts around Guernica, which is like, just to fill in, paint a picture, so to speak. It's a piece by Picasso. It might be his most well-known piece. It's this massive painting. And I think it was, oh my gosh, I'm going to show my ignorance here, but I think it was World War One. It was in Spain and it was a bombing that happened at night. And it's a very sad painting. It's very deep. I would love to see it in person. But the thing about this painting is it's done entirely in black and white. And I remember, I think I was reading a book called Muse and like, anyways, but they were talking about Guernica. And I remember thinking that like part of why it was so special is because it was in black and white. And if you think about it, as someone living in early 20th century, art would have been relegated to color, right? It would have been like art painting specifically was sort of an excuse to use color a lot of the time, not entirely, but like the essence of a good painting is like you found and sourced the brightest blues and it's huge and it fills up a space and it's so colorful. For an artist, especially one who has such color mastery as Picasso, to intentionally select to make a whole painting in black and white, like it wasn't just a move to like make it somber. You also have to think about the people living at the time. Like what looking at something black and white when you've been looking at a war the first time in history, published in the news, in a newspaper print, in black and white. And the fact that because now like we don't have that experience of we get all our news in black and white and the whole world is in color, like we will never get to experience that like visceral sensation of like you have been coded as a person to look at the world in our news in black and white, world in color. And then when someone inverts that, like that is a sensation that only those people in that part of the world and that part of can get. And it's like we would rather our artwork have this like huge, wide spanning cultural significance when, and I think in a lot of ways, that work was a love letter to those people living through that war and needing to see that in that way. And I think something we rob ourselves of when we pay so much attention to cachet and all of those things is that we rob ourselves of enjoying artists who are making love letters to us right now. Sabrina
Hmm.
Carpenter's album, it might not age the best because she might get womaned in 5 years, but right now it's fun and we're all having fun. And when I make art, I'm making it for people who grew up on the internet, who are my age. I mean, you don't have to exactly be it, but like that's a big part of why I'm making artwork. And so, anyways, I'm ranting a little bit, but
No, and
yeah.
I think that you're getting at something that this book made me think about a lot that I'm having trouble articulating of like we as a society are in the age of buying and selling emotions and emotional experiences. However, we do not value emotions as like as a thing at large. So we're kind of in this place where we're like pretending that we're buying and selling other things, but really at the end of the day, what we're buying and selling is like I the cynical way to think about it is like we lost all community and now they're selling it back to us. But
Yeah.
like that's what they're selling back to us. And I think that we try to come up with these things that it's like, no, you're actually paying for this cachet and this context and all of this. But I think at the end of the day, what you're really wanting out of all of these things is that deeper emotional experience. But we're not quite there yet to be able to like actually talk about that or like admit that. And I think that's part of like where the tension is with art, is because the people who are in charge, like billionaires and stuff, are so removed. Like the decision makers are so removed from all of that because they're getting their community in completely different foreign ways with people who are just so far removed from like the day-to-day life experiences of like people who would like go to a concert. Like even something I've been talking about is I'm actually like worried that we've kind of devalued the concert experience emotionally. And like artists like Olivia Rodrigo, I think she'll be fine. But this tour, I think, was a little bit inaccessible to some of her core fans due to price and just it being like the hottest ticket, that I think is going to have long-term effects of like people aren't going to be as invested in her because we see the concert as just a transaction of like you paid, you got a show. But that is a site of community building, of relationship building, of like where that connection between artist and like audience is made so deep that you can't put a value on that for the artist, but we've put a value on it for the audience. And so then you're pricing out people who can't be there, but who later in life maybe would have given more value to that artist. And like, so it's like we see the transaction in the moment and we're not thinking long term about like what's at stake here. But I think you're right. Like experiencing things at the same time as other people has such value and we're starting to see it. And I think that's why I roll my eyes when these executives say, I want to go viral. But I also am like, you're starting to see that this is what matters, is
Yeah.
like everybody like coming together and rallying around someone. Yes, you see it because you're like, this is what
Metrics.
successful companies are doing.
Yeah.
But the real metric there of virality is not like high number on screen. It's everybody cares about this at the same time. And that's what they're really asking for at the end of the day is I want everyone to care about this at the same time. And so it's an annoying ask, but it's getting closer to a human ask as opposed to like make me a ton of money, you know?
Yeah, 100%. No, I mean, I think you're spot on with the emotion thing. I think people don't want to admit it because emotion is
Mhm.
steeped in misogyny and all kinds of, it's very
I
antithetical
also
to like,
think men don't have like I think men I feel like I've come to terms with how inept men are at emotion like very recently of just like they just literally don't understand and aren't taught and I think they're scared. Like I
yeah,
think it's like an unknown variable that they just don't want to have to interact with. But I think we're getting to the point where like no, the survival of capitalism is going to depend on you understanding women's emotions.
catch
Like
up.
we're there.
100%. It's so funny. You know what book you would love? I'm reading it right now. I think I'm about,
Is it Filter World? Because I just ordered it.
what is it?
Filter World?
No, no, not that one. No, you will like that. It's Survival of the Friendliest, and it's talking
Uh-huh.
about how getting I want to tie this back to the emotions. I'm hoping my brain remembers this, but basically it's sort of an anthropological, is that the word? Yeah, deep dive into why humans evolved. And I usually don't like evolution books and stuff. I think it gets weaponized looking at you, Darwin. But anyways, I it's basically these researchers who studied you know that dog experiment that happened in Russia or they domesticated foxes, and they just kept picking the friendliest ones, and then they were able to make them have floppy ears, and like they were nicer. Their window of like bonding time went from like a couple weeks when they were puppies to like half of their life. So they studied that, but there was a breakthrough that happened kind of sort of recently where they realized that that domesticity actually connected with intelligence. So there was this prejudice, this bias that like if you are softer, friendlier, more neotenous, which is just more like childlike in your features, that you are less intelligent. There was an inverse correlation, I think, but there was
Hmm.
the opposite, and it
Hmm.
it happened because this researcher was trying to get bonobos and chimps specifically to understand a point, right? You know, human babies understand points; it's a developmental thing. But
Hmm.
the guy was like, "Man, I think my dog could do this," and the main researcher was like, "No, like you're young. What are you talking about?" But then they did the study and the dog got the point. And basically, the book's argument is that we are sort of self-domesticating ourselves. And there's a point in the book that I want to bring up about specifically comparing us to Neanderthals, which are they were bigger, they were stronger, they were more masculine.
Hmm.
They could have clawed a human to death, right? But the reason that we survived them out is because we were more emotional, friendlier, had kinder faces. The traits that we often associate with women are the traits that helped us survive. And it brings me to my own, I'm always like sewing a narrative as I read a book. um, but it led me to this point of like, there was a comedian one time who said, like, the men who aren't getting it, the ones who are choosing to sort of say, stay back and not progress, like you're going to get left behind. Like we are evolving, past this. And I think to your point of like, you're going to have to learn to contend with emotions because not only is it relevant, but it's the thing that helped us survive. Like whether we called
Hmm.
it emotion or we translated it through spirituality or however we coped with it, emotion is kind of at the forefront of how we deal with things as people. So like the going
Hmm.
viral, it just like it cracks me up thinking of like a executive being like, well, I want to go viral and like teenage girls do it. Like how hard can it be? And it's just
Exactly. Exactly. And I think also I like this book was about gatekeepers and who are the gatekeepers and how the gatekeepers have such an important impact on what actually is seen as quote unquote successful. However, I think that the internet has created its own gatekeeper in the quote unquote algorithm. And so I've said this in my 2024 predictions episode, like people are going to make art, they're going to sell it to each other, they're going to tell their stories, they're going to make music. It's just a matter of like, is there who is going to be the in-between person or company or entity brokering those exchanges? And I actually think that like these companies could just completely like remove themselves from the conversation. Like Hollywood is kind of doing that. Like that's a big conversation right now in LA, like the downturn of Hollywood. And I'm like, they've done this to themselves. Like they are in the emotions business and they are not acting like it. And so people are now getting what they used to get out of Hollywood elsewhere. And it's just people are going to get their needs met. And if you stand in the way of that, they'll find a new way. And like, yeah, maybe it'll take a while, but it'll just happen. I'm obsessed with desire paths. Do you know about this?
no, huh?
Desire paths are like this phenomenon of like people will like make a path to go the easiest way. So if there's like, a shortcut people will take, then there'll
Oh,
be like a path in the road where it's like clearly you were supposed to take this sidewalk, but like this is shorter. So there's a pathway worn out that's called a desire path. And I just am so like, I feel like I so clearly see the desire paths are moving away from capitalism and like these people who have enjoyed being the gatekeepers for so long that I'm like, can you guys not see that you're like they're over here now. They're going this way and you're
yeah.
going to lose them, you know?
I love that. No, it's funny. When you said desire path, I was thinking like some kind of like Jungian like personality test or something. It's so I'm like my brain is rotten, but 100%. It's so funny. Yeah, when you bring up desire paths, it reminded me of something and now I'm like blanking
Hmm.
on it. Man. No. Yeah, desire paths is perfect because I do think people are going to, yeah, I mean, the emotional needs are there. It's funny because like one thing I wanted to mention about emotions is
Hmm.
actually something that I've been sitting on for a while, which is like right now there's like a discussion about like what does JD Vance bring to the table? Not to like hard right turn right now, but the thing is they did this thing where they sort of looked at Donald Trump and his demographic and they looked at a candidate and I think they just tried to pick like metrics, like who ticks the boxes of like would vote for. But what I think they don't realize that Donald Trump, for as much of an absolute monster as he is, that he does well is he speaks to the emotional needs of people who are, I think, feel very neglected and downtrodden, whether it's valid or perception, whatever. He speaks to shame. He is
Hmm.
speaking to one of the biggest, most motivating emotions. It's an emotion that is actually tied to your personal identity, and it's I am not worthy. And so I think it's interesting that people will vote against their interests. They know that they're going to have more money taken out of their paycheck or that the things that their food stamps are going to get cut because
Hmm.
the hurt of emotion is worth more than the pragmatic weighing out of benefits. And if that doesn't speak to the importance of emotions, I don't know what is. And it's not just some fringe girls on TikTok dealing with emotions. The people who I think are the least aware of their emotions are the ones getting yanked the hardest by people who
A
do know what they're doing.
1,000%. And this is something that they talk about, like all of the male spaces online, and something that male creators are starting to come to realize is like, okay, you start working out, it goes down an alt right pipeline. Like you want to get into healthy eating, it goes down an alt-right pipeline. You want to get into self-improvement, it goes down an alt-right pipeline. And this is because they know that these people have all of these big feelings that they don't know what to do with. And they present them with a path and say, do this. And then it feels good because you feel understood, but your emotions are never actually cared for or thought about. They're just weaponized against you in order to get you to
Yeah.
do what they want at the end of the
Rage
day.
bait, vote for
Yes.
someone, buy an
Yes.
NFT. Oh my
Yes.
God,
And
full
I think
circle.
like even the fact of this being like a vibes based race, like that's what everyone's been saying, has been like part of us coming to understand that these things matter. And like the Democrats have been running with this of like, we choose joy, we choose happy, we choose like whatever. And like
Yeah.
people even saying, will say like, look at Tim Waltz, his kids love him. And like people
Yeah.
like him. Like that's been a thing of like, look at how much these guys' wives love them compared to Donald Trump and JD Vance. And so we're starting to get there of like love and emotions and like care and community being metrics that people see as valuable. But I worry that like we're going to have to hit rock bottom before
Move.
before we get
Yeah.
there for everybody. But I think artists have always done this. They've always been able to take emotions and turn them into a consumable vibe for people.
Yeah.
And like that is part of why I've said this to people, like what you said about your work. I'm like, she's literally like, you were born in 1991, right?
Yeah. December
Yeah.
of 19. Yeah.
Yes,
Exactly.
exactly. Exactly. No, that matters because like I always think it's 92,
Yeah.
but it's not. But I'm like, she was literally born the same year as me.
Yeah.
And we have all the same references. And so like your work speaks to me, like literally like the dolphin painting you did recently. Like I
Yeah.
had a visceral reaction to that because it was the dolphin of my childhood. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like this stuff does matter and like seeing my experience articulated, like it's like, oh wow, this is moving, you know what I mean? And so I think that type of thing also breeds confidence in people in their own identity in a way that I think we're not invested in breeding confidence in the female identity the same way
Yeah.
that we are in the male identity. But I think that we're moving away from that, and I think more female artists are going to be huge for that.
Yeah, I love that. No, and I think that's I mean that's the beauty of art is like I always think like I enjoy making art because I like it, but like I enjoy consuming art because like I love people. Like I love someone taking the time to be like this is how I feel. And I have to, there is art that I may not always be able to get all the way into simply because I haven't lived those experiences, but like the labor of someone saying like this is how I feel, this is what's important, this is why it matters, and then seeing even aesthetic triad, like seeing someone else like react to it emotionally, like that is
Mm-hmm.
a beautiful thing
Yeah.
to witness and be a part of. And I think especially when it's like, whenever I'm making art, like it's never far from my thoughts where I'm like, I'm painting it and I feel like, it gets very woo woo, but like I am putting in there like the love that I think that like teenage girls should have gotten. Like it's kind of like my axe to grind in a lot of ways is like we really devalue young women. And it's like the reason why that really bothers me is because I feel like it's so traumatic. Like going from
Mm-hmm.
like being a child and like especially like in our age group where we sort of had this like false sense of like we fixed all the world's problems and the
Yes.
hard reality of realizing we didn't,
Mm-hmm.
particularly if you are feminine or female or you identify as a woman, like you have this experience where it's like you can do anything, you can be anything, and it's what you do that matters. And then you get out into the world and somewhere between 12 to 16 you figure out that what I look like, what I weigh, what I wear, the brands, like it directly impacts how human people see me and how absolutely traumatic that is to experience that, but then people to point out all the ways you cope with that and say that that's lesser, that's not good, it makes you more worthy of the shame that you're feeling is evil. And so all
Yeah.
I'm trying to do with my artwork sometimes is it's my own wounds too. It's very selfish, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm also trying to say that anyone who recognizes it, like this is elevated, this is art, this is important, your feelings are valid, that was traumatic as hell. And like it's that emotional sharing of like if we're all feeling it, like there's something even mildly healing about that.
Yeah.
That's the hope anyways.
I completely agree. And that was something I've been thinking about too. Like, I firmly believe that there should be a layer of, a layer between artists and like the output. Like
Yeah.
in my line of work, it's like the marketing critics. Like, even I sometimes was that layer of like, this is great, but it's not going to play well because of XYZ reasons. Like this is art and it's beautiful, but at the end of the day, we need something that is this because that's what's going to do well. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And I think in my ideal world, and I'm curious, you're like, maybe you're like, no, this is not how it should be. Like the Jacks of the world should protect that and like
Mhm.
be like, I want to like make sure that you have the space to do that. So I'm going to make sure that you're being funded and like can do that instead of like having to worry about making yourself marketable. Like, because I do think marketing is a skill. I think it's an industry that's become like very bogged down in metrics and stuff like that. But I think it could be beautiful and advertising is important and like all of that stuff. But I think that like that is something people feel in the like I feel it when I look at your art, like, you know, and I
Mhm.
think like, you know, I think vibes are real. Like I think that's like a thing of like everything
Yeah.
is imbued with vibes and like how purposefully that is or how it's not like matters. And
Yeah.
I think that in an ideal world, there would be not so much commerce in the mind of the artist because I think it's actually detrimental to furthering the art. But maybe you're like, no, having that as one of the walls of my sandbox is actually like beneficial. Like, I don't, what do you think?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. No, I think you're with the Jack thing absolutely spot on. And that's actually that's something I wrestle with a lot because I have heard people who I really, really respect and admire and largely overwhelmingly agree with, people who work in sort of the more, what is it, like the higher into the art world, museums and etc., voice their disdain for representational realism. I promise this will loop
Mm-hmm.
back.
Mm-hmm.
And my big thing is like, I think it's kind of classist to think that because not because it's classist per se, but rather a lot of working artists, their on ramp into being in the art world is they have to appeal to the people around them. You know, your uncle's
Mm,
buying a painting from you, your friends,
yeah.
like before you can get to a point where you get to be in those spaces where you no longer have to do representational realism. A lot of times you have to learn that so you can do your dog portraits and you can do your house portraits and you can work your way up. Certainly that was my
Mm-hmm.
experience. And there's a disdain in the art world because people overwhelmingly who don't have arts background prefer and are actively hostile to art that isn't perfectly realistic. We saw that with like
Mm-hmm.
the wedding painter person.
Yes.
People were outraged. I think it was so stupid. So much projecting. People are
Mm-hmm.
financially insecure. I mean, I get it, but just
Mm-hmm.
like completely out of pocket. But I will say, because I'm always trying to, again, check my own biases, as I usually, when I feel passionate in that way, and it's someone I really agree with, I try to argue really hard the other direction. And so where I ended up coming to was I think to those people, it's really important that they don't have to ingratiate themselves to the masses because for certain identities, it's really hostile. And so I absolutely think that there should be ample space and corners of the art world that don't need to appeal to masses and in fact are actively sheltered from them. And so I think that it's a little bit of an overshooting of like we don't have to appeal to you. You guys aren't even all the way safe. Like look at how you vote. You know, like I don't want
Yeah.
to appeal to you. And I think that I think you can overswing, but I think that there's actually some kernels of like kindness and wisdom to that. And that's kind of where I parsed out at this point. So, but yeah, there should be Jacks. There should be Jacks that say like, hey, your incredibly niche experience as a refugee from a Middle Eastern country in this particular time period is never going to play well with a largely Islamophobic world. So here is this show where you have to have the context, where we provide the context, and you don't have to appeal to people. I think there should always be spaces like that, but it shouldn't be a hard no if you can play with those other spaces.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I actually really love the parts where she was at Art Basel.
Yeah.
But I also this was another thing where like my New York critique, like I felt like a lot of her critiques, I was like, well, this is a skewed sample. This is like a group of people who have decided to go to the Coachella of art to see and be seen and like go to the parties and you know what I mean? Like
Good
she was
point.
very critical of a lot of like the way that they moved as being representative of the whole art scene that in that portion, I was like, okay, this is definitely an over assumption just because like I know people who go to Art Basel and like they're a specific type of person. You know what I mean?
100%. No, it's funny you brought that up because that would bring me to kind of my big one criticism of the book, which was that
Uh-huh.
chapter. Because she did the whole like just be yourself and it'll all work out, which I'm always really critical of because that's a very privileged ability to do that, because the more marginalized you are, the more that's not true,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
If I just was myself all the time, like I come from a culture that's a little more like brass and crass, and it
Hmm.
doesn't, I can't do that. And so for her, as like someone who grew up sort of more upper middle class and white, like she's able to sort of do that and connect with people. That's not the case for everyone. I think that was my only like I had to like put a note. But that, I mean, otherwise, I think she did a really good job. But with the selling of the art, there's like yeah, it's convenient if you speak the language. Even though she diverted back into her own interest, I think there's a lot of, anyways, privilege to that take.
Yeah. And even like with that, I thought it was interesting. I'm always interested, something I'm realizing as I'm talking through this is like I'm very attuned to people's motivations beyond just like what they're doing. And so like with the people that she was with the art selling, and I was like, they kind of love this. Like there's a certain type
Yeah.
of person who loves like doing the bootstrapping thing of like, well, we have to do this or it's not going to work out, and like
Yeah.
taking risks and like seeing if they play out. So, like, for context, they were going to Art Basel and they were like, if we don't sell this many not paintings because they were photos, if we don't
Yeah.
sell this many photos, like, we're going under. We need to sell this many to do this next show we want to do, and we need to sell this
Yeah.
many to do this other show we want to do. And it was like stress. And like some people love to come from that place of like, it's do or die. If I don't get this done, it's not happening. And they love the rush that comes with like getting it done at the end of the day. And so even that, I was like, I'm not sure if these people even like love art as much as they love
Adrenaline.
the adrenaline
Yeah.
of like all of it. You know
Do
what
or
I mean?
die. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
100%.
which was interesting.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a feature of the art world. I think you do get your like adrenaline junkies, but in a financial sense, drawn to art. Like right now, the art world is going through a recession, which I think is always predictive, if I do say so myself. But anyways, what do I know? But it's so I'm seeing a lot of like art commentary on my Instagram feed of people like
Hmm.
completely freaking out, and like the secondary
Hmm.
market's all funky because of it. But yeah, I mean, there's people who are going to sportify, I think, anything and everything. And I think that's always,
Yes.
again, like another sign that like it isn't, maybe you do like art, but it isn't as real to you as someone who like no matter where they were at would be doodling and sketching and making and creating and sharing and all the things that artists tend to do.
Yeah, but that's also like the reality of it, which is part of why I think artists need some of that distance, because I could see how like they had this couple who I thought was really funny, the icy gays, I think they called
Yes.
them. And they were just like the two gay men who had decided that they were going to like make art buying a hobby and a passion. And like they seemed to be 50-50. Like they liked art, but they also liked the pomp and
Game.
circumstance of it
Yeah.
all, the game of it all, the sportification of it all, to use your word. And like that's the reality of things. And I'm not saying that that's inherently good or bad, but I do think that if you get too caught up in that, as I think a lot of people are incentivized to, because at the end of the day, that's the bottom line, that's where the art suffers.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'm glad you brought up the icy gaze. I loved their storyline. I'm really, as much as I'm passionate about turning people into artists, I also think that people should be art collectors, art critics, art writers. I think it's like there's nothing that shows me more that certain things of aspects of humanity really should be group projects. And in a
Hmm.
highly individualistic society, that's not always the easiest thing to persuade people. But absolutely. I mean, I teach and mentor and coach and stuff with artists. And one of the things I'm always droning on about, honestly, is you need to make sure your marketing hat is never on when you're at your easel, and you need to make sure that your art hat is never on when you're marketing yourself, because those things are, for most people, super, super counterproductive, right? When you're like doing your like third, it's a sale email, like there is something that can tear at your soul as an artist when
I
you do that.
bet.
And I also
Yeah.
think you don't make good art when you're thinking about algorithms and when you're thinking about sales. I mean, I think obviously I would also like to point out that there's probably some privilege in that. Like some people, like don't have that choice. And so double highlight that point. But I think if you can, as much as you can, try to keep those things as separate as humanly possible, because it's you really like how much is it art if you're like every piece of art you make is like a compromise because you're having to appeal to everyone. And certain art is compromised. Like I do a commission every, couple of months. Those are great, they're secure, but it's not like my work. So I think having all those things sort of separated out is important. But to back to the icy gaze of it all, that's why it's important to have people who like are part of that community, who are buying and who are, because one thing, a divide in the art world is there's some people who make art and then they market it themselves. Like I consider myself kind of like that. I have some galleries I work with. I'm not represented on like a full-time roster. So I have to do a lot of that legwork myself. And then once you do kind of get to that tier where you're represented, you don't have to do that anymore. They schedule collectors to come by and do studio tours. Like you were saying, that was a very art world specific sort of references in the book. That's a very like niche art world way that runs. Most artists, the vast majority, have to do all that kind of themselves. And I think the more we can relegate like regular people to be part of that, whether you're buying it or you're writing about it or you're sharing about it, like the better that whole system works, I guess.
Yeah, I love that. And I've been working on my like consumerism, like growing up in America, and like also I didn't like have we weren't wanting for like the basics when I was younger, but like there was no extras, like
Yeah.
I didn't ask for things, I wouldn't get things,
Right.
So like it's been really nice to be an adult and be like, I can get myself things,
Yes.
and it
Yeah.
gets really easy to get caught up in like, okay, I'm going to buy this, I'm going to buy this. And I just have those impulses. And now when I have those impulses, I find myself being like, okay, let's go buy some art. Like if
Yeah.
you're going to use like shopping as like this coping mechanism, and like let's
Yeah.
channel it into something that's a little bit more like pro art and pro the world, and less just like mindless consumption just because, you know what I
Oh,
mean?
I mean, that's kind of what the IC gays were doing. No, I think that's so
Yeah.
good. I mean, I do that. Anytime I sell a big piece of work, I relegate a chunk of it to go buying something from someone. And the thing is, especially, and this is kind of how art does work anyways, but like, if you experience like marginalized identity or like you have experienced something that's kind of niche or something like that, you can sort of put that into other people who've experienced something similar or something maybe you don't experience, but you're passionate about. And
Mm-hmm.
there is not a better way to sort of give back. And obviously I'm saying this as an artist, and so yeah, it's a little yucky. But the thing is, and this is not just me, but like when you invest in an artist, you're investing in someone who can sit in our current culture, think deeply, and make a living off of that. Like I think there's not much of a better way to spend your money. Like if you are like, hey, I grew up in the Midwest, queer kids, didn't get much respect, and their youth homelessness was much higher for them. As an artist who's queer living in the Midwest, like you may not have as many opportunities to show, and so you can be part of this icy gaze and
Mm-hmm.
choose to uplift those people as a way to sort of give back in that community. And I think that's
Yeah.
really special, and you get art about it, and back to the whole emotion of it all. Like I think it can be this really altruistic process, which is why I always am personally very upset when it sort of gets co-opted as this like highfalutin highbrow culture thing. Like go to a craft market and support an Ecuadorian woman who's making, jewelry from her home tradition. Like that's so great and special and
Yeah.
unique. And you have jewelry and like, what's not to love?
Yeah. And I also think that we are a group think like people. Like that was something even in the Art Basel chapter of like once they had sold one thing, it was then easier to sell more things because you
Yep.
were able to tell people like, well, that one's already sold. And then it becomes
Yeah.
like a scarcity mindset
Yeah.
thing of like, but this is even something I've experienced while shopping. Like me and my sister joke, like if we ever go shopping together and we like both like something like and we have a conversation about it, then everyone's like, what is that? Like, what are
Yeah.
they talking about? What do we need? Like, and there
I
is
overlooked
kind of
something. Yeah.
exactly. And it's like, I'm sure there's psychology behind this and I would love to read about it, but like things seem more attractive when other people are either owning them or interested in them or looking at them. And so even it's just this like it's this really interesting catch 22 where like in order to have success, you need to have success.
Yeah.
So I'm always like, wouldn't it be so cool if I could be part of someone's like first initial success? Like, and
Yes.
especially with TikTok, like there was this artist who I'm blanking on her name. I'll send it to you so you can put
Yeah.
it in the show notes.
I
But
will.
she painted a bit from Kendrick Lamar's video, Not Like Us, where he's like
Mm.
hopscotching and like it's a still from the video. She painted it. And like I saw this when it had very little views and I was like, I want to print. Like, and someone had
Yeah.
said, like, can you please make prints? And I liked that. And there was like no views. This went viral. And then because it went viral, like she made prints. And I was like, this is so cool because she probably sold so many prints.
Yeah.
And like I was literally like, she's gonna be able to buy so much more stuff, like
Yes.
work on
Go to
her
art
art.
supplies, start
Like
it all
I
over
was
again.
just like one hit thing. And then she's able to fund like maybe the next few months of like. And
Yep.
so it was just really cool to be part of that moment and like be like, cool, I supported this artist while she was having her viral moment. You know what I mean?
Yes, I love that. No, it's so communal. It's so beautiful. That's why I think I like that the book even kind of left on like that like note of like how do you contribute? How do you support other artists? I think it's beautiful. That's why, yeah. I mean, I buy too much art and we do art trades and stuff, but it's so fun. It's so addictive. That's why like I don't know, somebody needs to write a book of like how to collect and write about art for like the everyday person. Would love that. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yay.
The
Oh, go
last
ahead.
thing I'll say about this that we didn't touch on was Allfire and the woman who was doing like the performance art as like a sex worker.
Yes.
And I thought that that was so interesting, specifically because the artist herself brought up the question. She's like, people have asked me, do you think that you just want to do this and you call it art so that you don't feel weird about it? And she was like, and I don't really know the answer. And I just thought that was such an interesting question. So I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
I love that. Yes. Oh my gosh. Thank you for bringing that up, first of all, because I didn't want to forget about her because I liked her. Yeah. I think what she's doing is great. I think that's kind of the thing about art is like, it is a protection. It's like, I'm trying to think of what a good example of it is. It's, you know, when you're wrestling as a kid and you say uncle and it means like you're tapped out. Like I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
think like it's a little bit of like a safe word to us culturally. Like when something is art, we give it bigger parameters versus like when it isn't art. And art
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really have a good clear definition. It's a communal project. It's sort of like I say it's art, you agree. It's art, you know, and that's kind of how it works. And so like yeah, I mean, I think what if it is? What if she just wants to do it and she wants to call it art so she doesn't feel weird? I mean, like, isn't that what art is? Like, I want to
Yeah.
make pictures of things from my childhood that I found at thrift stores and find really cathartic to make it into art. Like, if that wasn't a convention, like I would still want special protections for that. And I think that gets to a point where I think where a lot of people struggle with the idea of what makes something art is it actually has a lot to do with like I think anytime we give anyone in our culture special treatment, people get really upset about that. And I don't know
Mm-hmm.
why. Um, and I just think, yeah, art is an attempt to say, can we treat this special? And then it becomes a communal. And I think it's interesting because that makes art always a good litmus test for like what we value as a culture. And I think it gets back to the kitsch of it all and all, you know, and like the craft and the like, you know, we're not going to call it art because I know I think it's like it's you're opening a Pandora's box. You know, I think really most anything can be art. Obviously, if you want to follow that to a really negative side, you get to the whole like free speech, you know, it gets a
Mm-hmm.
little dark.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, if we have protections over free speech, then I think sort of the counter and the opposite to that is that we have protections over something we would consider art. And it's stressful because when there's not an objective, clear, defined boundary around it, we go from it being like an enforceable thing to like a group project, and we just don't like that. So it's this gray area. But if she thinks
Yeah.
it's art, then it's art.
Yeah. Yeah. What you said made me also think one of my hypotheses has been, you know how man on the street interviews are like all over the place now?
Yeah.
I really do think like these men just want to talk to women and they don't feel like they can. So they go and get a microphone and get a camera and are like, let's have a conversation. And it
Yeah.
kind of like, I think it's a similar thing. I'm not saying what they're doing is art, but it's like this idea of like calling what you're doing how you want people to treat it is very, very
Mhm.
interesting because it's like, it's like, it's the marketing of it all. But
Yeah. Well, and it's also vulnerable and scary, which I think always shines light on power structures. So like I
mhm.
have a series of work that's like all about tacky and like, you know, what is tacky, what's over the top,
Have you read that book, by the way? Tacky?
you know, I downloaded it and it like glitched in my Audible. I need to just go get the physical book because I think I prefer to read it that way anyways, but
It
I
was
have
really
it
good.
in my Audible and I'll show you it like doesn't pull up. But anyways, but it's about tacky the idea anyways but I always say that the most tacky part of these paintings because I paint these like gas station pastries with like bright colors on these bright patterns and you know it's this idea of like things clashing but the tackiest part is the fact that I put a gold frame on it because when you go to like art museums like the real sign of like real art is like someone has put light on it, it's in a museum and there's a gold frame on it. And I think that like when you aren't someone who's been given a lot of power saying it's art is like a huge faux pas. And I think that's where like I think that's question the author was really smart to include that because I think that's what we're actually asking. I think it's guised as what's art and more of like are you worthy enough of a person? Are you seen as culturally having enough value to call what you do art? And I think that's just an interesting
Yeah,
tell, honestly.
totally. Totally. I love that.
Yeah, but that's why I love art because it shines light on, I don't know, all that stuff. But anyways, I know this is getting very long.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed
I
it.
just looked at the time. I had not looked at the time. I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine. My kids are like playing in a little kiddie pool in the backyard, so they're happy. Lincoln's out there; they're not alone. So,
I
but
figured.
but thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts before we go?
No, just thank you for another great summer of reads. And you have other books you recommended to me, so I'll be checking those out as
Oh my
well.
gosh,
But
I'm so excited to hear your thoughts on them. Yes, I would send you all the books. I just don't want to overwhelm you. But thank you so
no,
much. Thank you for your insight. I always appreciate it. I'm an artist. I feel like I make myself inbred or insular when I talk about all things art. So your perspective is just interesting, not only because you're interesting, but your background, your point of view, you're a great mixture of insightful and critical, and of course you're a Virgo. So yes, that makes sense. But
oh,
thank you so much for being here. I know my audience adores having you on. Also, you have a podcast and you've had some really good episodes recently. So if you are like, you still want your Megan fix, you can definitely check out your podcast. It's called Megan's Podcast. I will link it definitely. And you also give a lot of great book recommendations on your Manicured Shelf account on Instagram, Virgo like Beyonce on TikTok. Any other plugs? How can people keep up with you?
no, those are the best places. Thank you so much for having me. This is
Yay.
one of the funnest things I get to do. So thank you.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you, Megan. Thank you so much for listening and thank you for being here. I wanted to also encourage you guys to leave a review. The feedback is incredibly helpful. And if you leave a review, I will read your handle or your name on the following week's episode. Again, thank you so much. Take care, y'all, and happy creating.